First Things, episode number 19.
I seem to be lost.
And so you're working around the clock so you don't take time for yourself to feel like an actual human being.
I used to feel like no matter how hard I worked, I was just spinning my wheels.
Try to be perfect. We try to have everything in place at one point in time, and you can't.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to First Things, the podcast dedicated to practical productivity based on modern research. My name is Brandon Vaughn. I'm your host, and it's my goal to help you apply productive solutions to your life to help you live with less stress, greater passion, and amazing results. Last week, we began our first week of study into Neil Fiore's book called The Now Habit, which is about procrastination. And today, we are dealing with chapter 1 of that book, which is entitled Why We Procrastinate. So let's review a little bit of what we talked about last week, although you can go back to that episode and listen to it, but let's reiterate a couple of points that we talked about as we build upon this. Last week, we covered the basic definition of procrastination, which was this. Procrastination is a mechanism for coping with the anxiety associated with starting or completing any task or decision. Let me say that again. Procrastination is a mechanism for coping with the anxiety associated with starting or completing any task or decision. Now, some of us have been taught a very negative perspective of life, of a negative perspective of humans, a negative perspective of procrastination. Some of us have basically been taught that laziness and disorganization or other kind of character defects that people may or may not have is the reason why we procrastinate. Oh, you procrastinate because you're just lazy. You just need to get in there and start working. Be more organized, or some other kind of character trait about ourselves. The basic assumption is that people in general are lazy and therefore need pressure to motivate them. That's the underlying assumption behind how I was taught about procrastination, especially from teachers and other people in schools that I was at, that man's basic default state is laziness. And therefore, procrastination is just man being too lazy. And you have to constantly pressure them to make them do anything, to motivate them. And it's a very negative point of view when it comes to mankind in general, and also when it comes to procrastination. Dr. Theodore Rubin wrote a book called Compassion and Self-Hate. And in that book, he basically suggests that it is the fear of failure, the fear of being imperfect or perfectionism, and the fear of impossible expectations or being overwhelmed that prevent us from acting on or going after our goals or our relationships. When we have a fear of failure, it basically means you believe that even the smallest error is evidence that you are worthless and that you are an awful person. Now, some of us may not even vocalize it that way, but if we really analyze what we're thinking in those situations, that's basically what we're doing. That's basically what we're telling ourselves, even though we may not state it in those specific terms. Having a fear of being imperfect means that it's difficult for you to accept yourself as you are, imperfect, and therefore perfectly human. That's an identity that we must all strive toward. We are beautifully flawed. We are imperfect and thus perfectly human. And when we don't do that, we interpret any type of criticism, any type of rejection, any type of judgment by others as basically a threat to our own identity and worth, our own particular slant on perfection. We can have such impossible expectations that even after we've worked really hard and we've achieved goals that we've set for ourselves, the only reward for us will be continually higher and more difficult goals to achieve with no rest, no time for fun, no time to savor our achievements. As has been quoted elsewhere, our main problem is that we don't know what our main problem is, and that is our main problem. Our problem with procrastination, as we saw last week, is not procrastination. It's not a character defect. Rather, it's an attempt, a very unsatisfactory attempt, mind you, but it is an attempt to cope with an incapacitated fear of having our worth based upon what we do. It is a mechanism by which we try to cope with stress. It is a mechanism by which we try to cope with boredom. You do not procrastinate because you are lazy. As we saw last week, we all have examples of things in our lives that we don't procrastinate on, be that sports, hobbies, reading, music, dancing, investments, gardening? Or how about this? Text messages, Facebook, surfing the internet. Who actually procrastinates on doing those? So again, if you find just one thing in your life that you don't procrastinate on, no matter how trivial it is, then you are not a procrastinator. You are just someone who might struggle with procrastination in certain areas, but you are not a procrastinator. And as we said last week, we must learn to lose labels on ourselves. And if you have labeled yourself as a procrastinator, then stop it. Because as I've just shown you again, if you find even one instance in which you do not procrastinate, then that is not your identity. It just may be something that you deal with or struggle with in life. We procrastinate simply because, one, it works for us. And quite honestly, it makes sense. And number two, again, it provides a release valve to deal with criticism, failure, and perfectionism. We are not procrastinators. I just want to keep saying that over and over again, because quite honestly, some of us have based our identity upon this, and we have to start looking beyond that. We are not procrastinators. We procrastinate. And there's a huge difference between those two, because there's certainly a negative side to procrastination, and sometimes, quite honestly, there may be positive sides to procrastination, some of which we will kind of get into in this show. But we are really dealing with the negative aspects of procrastination, and we'll give some honest assessment of some of the positive sides of it as we get along inside of this particular book. And speaking of the book, I wanted to read from you 6 warning signs that Neil mentions in Chapter 1. Warning signs of procrastination. Number 1, does life feel like a long series of obligations that cannot be met? Do you, for instance, keep an impossibly long to-do list? Do you talk to yourself in have-tos and shoulds? Do you feel powerless with no sense of choice? Do you feel agitated, pressured, continually fearful of being caught procrastinating? Do you suffer from insomnia and have difficulty unwinding at night, on weekends, or on vacations, if in fact you even take vacations? Number 2, are you unrealistic about time? Do you talk about starting on projects in vague terms such as sometime next week or in the fall? Do you lose track of how you spend your time? Do you have an empty schedule without a clear sense of commitments, plans, sub-goals, and deadlines? Do you chronically arrive late at meetings and dinners? Do you fail to take into account the actual time it takes to drive across town during rush hour? Number 3, are you vague about your goals and values? Do you find it difficult to stay committed to any one person or project? Do you have difficulty knowing what you really want for yourself, but maybe you're clear about what you should want? Do you get easily distracted from a goal by another plan that seems to be free of problems and obstacles? Do you lack the ability to distinguish between what's the most important use of your time and what's not? Number 4, are you unfulfilled, frustrated, and depressed? Do you have life goals that you've never completed or even attempted? Do you fear always being a procrastinator? Do you find that you're never satisfied with what you accomplish? Do you feel deprived, always working, or feeling guilty about not working? Do you continually wonder, why did I do that, or what's wrong with me? Number 5, are you indecisive and afraid of being criticized for making a mistake? Do you delay completing projects because you try to make them perfect? Do you fear taking responsibility for decisions because you're afraid of being blamed if something goes wrong? Do you demand perfection even on low priority work? Do you expect to be above mistakes and criticism? Do you worry endlessly about what if something goes wrong? And number 6, are low self-esteem and lack of assertiveness holding you back from becoming productive? Do you blame outside events for your failures because you're afraid to admit any deficiencies? Do you believe I am what I do, or I am my net worth? Do you feel ineffective in controlling your life? Do you fear being judged and found wanting? So I'm curious if any of those things resonate with you at all. Does life feel like a long series of obligations that cannot be met? Are you unrealistic about your time? Are you vague about your goals and values? Are you unfulfilled, frustrated, or depressed? Are you indecisive and afraid of being criticized for making a mistake? Are low self-esteem and lack of assertiveness holding you back from being productive? Now, as Neil mentioned in his book, if you see only some of these warning signs in yourself, you may be procrastinating in some areas of your life while remaining in control in other areas or even in most areas of your life. So let's get down. What is the problem with procrastination? Because, again, some people may not see it as a big problem. And it's not really that you miss deadlines. Now, that could be a problem for some people, but most of the people that I've dealt with and helped in life, as long as myself, I don't really miss many deadlines. I don't have a lot of serious penalties or anything that I face. But what does happen is I often feel very rushed, feel very pressured, feel very unhappy with the results. And we have to admit there's a lot of very difficult tasks, very frightening, very unpleasant tasks. It becomes a very big stress factor for me. And I've noticed that in many other people. They live completely stressed out. They have constant anxiety, constant worry about delaying. They have constant guilt from inferior quality of the stuff that they're actually doing, waiting until the very last minute to actually get it through. They maybe have deep regrets about opportunities that they've missed, even deep regrets, for instance, in school, when you wait until the last minute to cram for a test, and then you look back years later and realize you didn't learn anything by doing something like that. So there's even a regret in situations like that, as well as the fact that if we do not embrace fun and creativity and relaxation, we will often burn out at some point. And that is another byproduct of procrastination, something that we will get into, something that was quite a revelation for me when I read Neil's book, because I never really associated fun and relaxation with procrastination. In fact, I used procrastination to excuse why I didn't have time to do those types of things, when actually by me pushing away those things, it was actually fueling procrastination. It was a very odd thing, a major revelation in my own life when I actually saw that. And again, we don't procrastinate because we're bad or lazy or lack organization. We simply do it because we fear a threat to our sense of worth and independence. We sense a threat to possible boredom and irrelevancy. It is a release valve for us, a release from just being average, which is pretty awful for some of us. To just be average makes us feel miserable, as if we're worthless. And we're pretty tough on ourselves. We really are. We expect all of our work to be superior, maybe even perfect. And when it isn't, we get very disgusted with ourselves, as if our projects and our work and our papers and our homework and our performance at our job becomes more than just work to be taken care of. For some of us, they become like a mirror. They are reflections of our worth, and as our person, our whole being is wrapped up in this very thing. So you have a project at your work, and instead of it being an expression of who you are, an expression of your creativity and adventure that you're on, that report becomes a mirror by which you look at and you actually see yourself in that thing. It becomes a basis of your identity and worth on this planet. And because I was raised in environments like this, especially in school, the typical answer I got was that life was all about discipline and willpower and pressure, and that work was never fun and it was something that you had to do. And I began to see myself as a split person. I had this lazy, childlike part of me that wanted to play and didn't want to work, that person had to be pushed to do work. So I came to see work as something I had to force myself to do, something that I would not have done otherwise. Thus, there's this constant battle and this inner conflict. And then I basically became convinced that thinking this inner conflict was normal was just normal. It produced a very negative self-talk inside of me, one which saw perfectionism as ideal and was very harsh on myself anytime I messed up. And it's amazing, we've dealt a whole episode on stinking thinking. It was one of my first ever episodes that we did in this podcast. But again, it is amazing to me how much of our thoughts we never question. And this negative self-talk, I've done this to myself, and I've been astonished when I've stopped and said, what are you thinking right now? And specifically, what did you just tell yourself? And we never challenge those thoughts. So many people that I have counseled and helped, when we really analyze what they were thinking or what they were telling themselves, they've been amazed and shocked by this negative self-talk, which basically just keeps going after ourselves when we mess up. The fact is, procrastination is rewarding. We have to face up to this. This is why we procrastinate. Again, not because we're bad and lazy. We do it because it's rewarding. Here's a quote from the book. The main reason we learn any habit, as Drs. Frederick Canfer and Janine Phillips tell us in The Learning Foundations of Behavior Therapy, is that even a seemingly counterproductive habit, like procrastination, is immediately followed by some reward. Procrastination reduces tension by taking us away from something that we view as painful or threatening. the more painful work is for you, the more you will try to seek relief through avoidance or through involvement in more pleasurable activities. The more you feel that endless work deprives you of the pleasure of leisure time, the more you will avoid work. Now, there are a couple of ways that we display this delayed reaction to our work. And there's many ways in which delaying it actually rewards us. And Neil talks about 4 different things in his book. The very first one is that we use it to resist pressure from bosses and authorities. Now, almost all of us could probably, if we're honest, admit that we don't always like being told what to do. In fact, that is the number one thing I've often heard from entrepreneurs and why they started their own business, because they didn't like other people telling them what to do. And quite frankly, procrastination can often be the result that we're resisting pressure from other authorities above us or outside of us telling us what to do. So many people, for instance, will wait until the last minute to pay their taxes, not because they're lazy, but there is this sense that I don't like the government telling me what I should do with my money, and therefore I delay it. Now, that's not true of everyone, but there is quite a number of people that is really the motivations if they were honest with themselves. Now, I can relate to this. I was in a junior college many, many years ago, and it was one of my most wonderful jobs I've ever had. I've never really been at a place where I so look forward to Monday just as much as I did Friday, because everything was such an adventure, and I just loved what I was doing. And I had a particular boss that was so much part of that adventure, and they weren't a micromanager, which I just cannot really stand personally. Have a real big problem with that. Well, this person ended up stepping down, had some illnesses and different things like that, and another person among the colleagues stepped up as part to take over. And this person was probably one of the worst bosses I've ever had. Extremely nice person, but one of the worst bosses. They micromanaged everything and was just so picky about every single thing. And it literally drove me crazy. And I found myself delaying tasks. I found myself not being very motivated. I found myself for the first time not really wanting to go to work. And it wasn't fun anymore. It wasn't an adventure. It suddenly became a duty for me, an obligation for me. And there were also changes going on in my own life, but this person was a big catalyst behind a lot of those changes inside of me. And I can look back and see how often I would delay tasks and just procrastinate on a lot of things that I wanted to do at first. And now all of a sudden I found myself pushing them off. And it was, in a sense, a loss of power and control. And so I reacted by procrastinating. I would forget things or misplace things or delay it or be late to meetings or do less than ideal work. And it was all a sense of control. It was a control issue. And in honesty, I was using procrastination as a means to try to regain some level of control in my life. And a part of that often is a pity party. We've mentioned this before in the podcast. Pity parties are very odd because you have to bring presence of pity in order to show up at the pity party that you're throwing. And I just find that for most people in my life, they never show up. I don't know why. I throw great pity parties, and man, I've got some great food and entertainment and music, and nobody shows up for my party. Now, you may have people in your life that show up to your pity party, but the fact is nothing ever gets accomplished for things like that, and they're basically a waste of time. But when you have these types of pity parties, when you are using procrastination to try to regain some control in your life, you basically have a victim mentality in your life. You are trying to achieve some type of self-empowerment. It makes you a slave to the other person. Now, really think about this. If you sense in your life that you may be procrastinating because of a particular person, a boss, a manager, or whatever, that basically means you have allowed yourself to become their slave. We can't do that. And that's not who we ultimately are. And in our procrastination, we actually think we are gaining control, but we're actually feeding a lie that says that we have no choice. And thus, we are giving up huge amounts of freedom, huge amounts of choice that we have in our life, and becoming a slave to that person. We must learn to replace the phrase, I have to, with I choose to. Because ultimately, you don't have to do anything. And you say, well, yes, I do, or I'll lose my job. You still have a choice. You could just lose your job. You could go get another job. Fact is, you don't have to do anything. You choose to, And the more that we can get into our lives that choice, that we do have a choice, the more freedom we actually have. You always have a choice. The second reward that he talks about in chapter 1 is that we lessen the fear of failure because we didn't do our best performance. So we lessen that fear of failure because we didn't do our best. Now, this is a much bigger area for me and for many of the people that I've actually helped in life, much more than maybe resisting power issues, which does happen a lot, but I find this happens even more. For instance, a few years ago, I had this big presentation that I had to put together, and it was going all the way up to a vice president of a company that I was consulting for. And I was just honestly really worried about failing because nothing I had done in that particular consulting area had ever gone up that high up the ranks. And this was a major company in the United States. And there was this fear of failure in me. And I find that I was procrastinating and I was putting off working on this presentation and putting it together, and everything kind of kept coming up. And every time I thought, I need to work on this, I would feel this. Now, I wasn't tangibly thinking this. I had to analyze my thoughts. It was just this mode that I gotten myself into, but it was there. And I found myself doing very trivial things. And I'm like, gosh, I had 4 hours. I could have worked on that today. What did I do? Oh, I surfed the email and the internet, and I went and talked to this person about this, and I didn't have to. I could have waited. And when I really was looking at this, why did I do all this? Well, it's because I had this fear of failure. And because of that, I procrastinated. This also happened when I did my dissertation. And I think I told you in my first episode that I had been through 3 doctoral programs. And one of them I'd started and didn't go very far because I was kind of burned out of school at that particular time. Then I went back to another one that was just kind of conveniently located for me, went all the way up to my dissertation, and then just kind of lost interest. It was really easy when I was just taking classes, but when I had to write this huge dissertation, this huge research paper, and get my degree, I lost interest in it. And I also had a lot of work that I was doing at the time, so there was a lot of distractions. And then I was in my 3rd program, and I'm looking back at my track record, and I'm sitting there thinking, I didn't finish the first one, I didn't finish the second one, and there's this fear that, again, I had to analyze to really see that that was the basis of things. It just wasn't apparent at first, but there was a fear of failure. And I wasted a half a year of not writing on my dissertation. There's this fear of, where do I start? Can I really finish this? Because I've never finished it before. It's such a huge task. I don't even know where to begin. And there was that part of the fear of failure. But then I started, when I really analyzed my thoughts, then I actually started putting action to that. Many of the things that we're going to be talking about in future weeks. And I actually finished. But it had to start with baby steps so small that it seemed ridiculous. And we're going to get into this. Many of the things I've talked about briefly in previous episodes. But the key so many times to getting started is just to start small. So incredibly small that it may seem insulting to you. Because in your mind, you should be spending 5 hours on this presentation. And the fact you only spent 10 minutes on it for 5 days a week may seem so ridiculously little. But you find that you actually start moving forward. And we'll get into this. But my big fear through all of that was that average. And I don't know what it is. I don't know if this resonates with you. But to me, and I've tried to see in my own life, where did this start? Because my mother has never taught me this, and I was raised by my mother. I didn't have a father figure when I was raised. My father left my family when I was real young, and my mother's not like this. My mother's not driven like this, and she never instilled this in me. And so I'm trying to figure out, did I get this from teachers, or where did I get this from? But basically, I just was raised thinking that average was the same thing as failing. And so literally in school, if I made a B on any assignment, to me that was the equivalent of an F. And if you've never noticed that, if you've never dealt with that, that may seem the craziest thing you've ever heard in your life. But now some of you who are listening to me can relate to that in major ways. So the fact that you spent time on a presentation again for your business and your boss basically said it was good, but they didn't say it was great, that will eat at you for the rest of the day, for the rest of the week or the month or the year. It's something about the fact that we base, again, our worth on what we do, on our performance, upon our productivity. And then that means that average is the equivalent to failure. Often, I think the reason why that is when we become too one-dimensional. And again, this is a quote from the book. Yale psychologist Patricia Linville found that the more complex and varied your sense of self the less likely you are to become depressed over stress in one area, because you have these uncontaminated areas of your life that can act as buffers. So let me give you an example of that. If I'm LeBron James, pro basketball player, Miami Heat, and I'm sitting there trying to make some free throws in basketball, missing a free throw might be devastating because that is a huge part of who I am. That's what the world knows me. The world knows me. If I'm LeBron James, who does the world know me as? The world knows me as a basketball player, not as a musician, not as a gardener. That's who I am. That's my basis. And I'm not saying LeBron, if you ever listen to this episode, that he faces this, but just as an example, I could see if I was LeBron, that would be a huge area that I would have to work in, because that's a big part of my identity is that. So if I miss a free throw, it could be very devastating, because that could be the free throw that wins the finals, the final championship game. But as Brandon Vaughn, amateur basketball player, it's no big deal. If I miss a free throw, I can go even play with a couple of guys and maybe we even have a little competition and I miss the free throw and blow the game. Well, I don't like that. And as a person that deals with perfectionism, that still may bother me, but it isn't nearly as big of a deal as it might be for LeBron James, because that's just a hobby for me. That isn't what I do for a living. That isn't how I make money. That is a very little part of my life. It's just a hobby to me. And therefore, because I have other things that I do in my life besides that, then a little defeat in that area is no big deal. I have multiple dimensions to my life, and basketball is just one little dimension. Well, what if it wasn't? What if I started putting more time into it and I started sacrificing other things in my life, and that became my biggest thing, to do basketball, and I just kept doing it and I didn't do anything else? Well, the more one-dimensional I become, then the more that failure in that area can start bothering me. The more major something is in your life, a major area in your life, a major source of your identity, meaning, and purpose, the more temptation to procrastinate, especially if we deal with fear of failure or rejection as part of our identity. So many times, and you should experiment with this, look at areas where you procrastinate in your life and ask yourself how big that area is in your life. Is it a major area in your life in terms of maybe your productivity, in terms of your income? Or is it a major source of who you are, your identity, your purpose, your meaning? So many times in our jobs, doing good in our job is maybe it's not even the job. Maybe it's just the fact that somebody says we did good. If we're really honest, that means so much to us, because that's how we've derived our identity and our purpose and our worth, is by other people praising us. And when somebody praises us, then it's a huge deal for us. And so our job basically is the means by which we have that drug of acceptance. And it's also the one that we fear rejection in. May not have anything to do with that particular job. You could replace it with a completely different job. It's just the acceptance that you're getting. So the way that we express this is all, again, very unique to us. But I would encourage you to look at your life and honestly say, do I procrastinate in areas that is a major area in my life, a major source of identity or purpose or worth? And I think if you're like most of the people I've talked to, you will say, yes, I can see that I don't procrastinate in this area because I don't base a lot of my identity off of it, but over in this area that I make money off of, or I do, yeah, I do. And that may be a big reason why you procrastinate in that area, because it is tied into those types of things. And what is the temptation in procrastination? The temptation in procrastination is simply that in doing so, we lessen our fear of perfectionism. And as crazy as this might sound, by doing this, I actually have an excuse for not being perfect because I've delayed starting on something. And this is really odd if you think about it, but I think it rings so true that some of us have this fear of perfectionism, a fear of failure, and therefore we are perfectionist in that. And you would think that because of that, we would never delay anything. But because we fear that, we will often use procrastination as an excuse for why we weren't perfect. Because if I fail at something, it's no longer a threat to my identity or my real person. Because if I had really put effort into it, then it would have been better. So I fear perfectionism. I fear failure. So by doing less than my best, I have an excuse for why I wasn't perfect. It gives me an out. And my self-worth can still maintain itself because I'm still the person I always thought I was, and the fact that I failed in this area, well, hey, it wasn't because of who I am. It's because I didn't put the time into it. I procrastinated away until the last minute. I didn't do my best work for this type of thing. It's an excuse that we can use in life not to do our best work, and therefore to deal with the failure that comes from it. It's a very weird thing, but if you think about it, for most of us, that's a very true statement. We must start learning to see our worth apart from what we do. And I know that's very easy to say, and it's a lifetime journey to live that out. I've been working on this in myself for, 20, 30 years since I started seeing this. And I still have areas that I'm on a journey in, and other areas where I've seen great success, great strides in overcoming weaknesses in these areas. But it's very true that you must start a journey, not a destination, but a journey to start seeing your worth apart from what you do, apart from your performance, apart from your productivity, apart from what other people think about you, their approval or their rejection of you. It has to be apart from all of that. We must learn to basically forgive ourselves for not being perfect, and to realize that being beautifully flawed is an amazing adventure in itself. We have to learn to get back up quickly when we do face defeat and to keep moving forward. The third reward that Neil talks about in chapter 1 is that some fear success. So this actually keeps them from doing their best. Now, this may seem kind of odd, that who would ever fear success, and why would you ever procrastinate because you feared success? But sometimes I've been worried, if I'm honest, again, I can trace this back. It's not a lot of areas in my life, but there were some that I feared that if I achieved too much, then people might give me more work. Someone might make me the dean of a college, or make me a manager or a vice president in a company. And I know that may sound strange, but that brought about a worry, a level of stress, a time involvement. Now, if I wanted to really do that, then no big deal. But if I didn't really want to do that, then sometimes I feared this pressure to do more work, to have more responsibilities that I didn't really want. And success would bring that pressure on me. Now, again, this may seem odd to some people, but some of us do fear success in some areas. To be successful might mean more pay or promotion, but it might also mean more stress, more time at work, more responsibilities, more work, and thus greater potential for failure in the future. See, this is how this is tied back to the fear of failure. Because if you have more work, if you have more responsibilities, more stress, you have more opportunities now to fail. So if you have twice as much stuff to do, to some of us, now we have twice as many opportunities to fail than we did before. Not only that, maybe perhaps we master something, and then this new thing is now uncomfortable to us. It's a new journey. It's a journey we've never been on before. And because of that, it's something we haven't mastered. Instead of it being an adventure for us, it becomes an obstacle that we may fail, and we may trip up and utterly fail at, and we fear it because of that. It's an opportunity not for success and adventure. It's an opportunity to fail in life. And therefore, we fear that success. We fear failure in a future state, if you will, because we've never done this role before. We've never done this task before, and it isn't comfortable. It isn't predictable for us. And then the last thing that Neil talks about, and I don't think he, if I remember right, I don't think he really referenced this specifically, but it's something that I've seen in life, and he hints at it several times in this chapter, is that the reward for procrastination is that some of us are hoping or praying for a miracle. Because occasionally, when we postpone a boring task, a task that we really don't want to do, somebody else may do it for us, or they may get it assigned to them, or people will forget. And one of the most amazing things I've seen in businesses, and I've seen this, and this may be an area that we'll get into in future weeks, maybe some possibilities for the only salvation of procrastination, if you will. But I've seen many times businesses will get so focused on we must do this, we must do this, we must do this. And they'll come up and constantly reinvent the wheel, constantly be doing stuff that I'm sitting there thinking, I just think that's a waste of time. And I don't think that's going to produce what you think it does. And I've been amazed that when I have just kind of stepped back from that for just a few days and just let it kind of die down, many times those things just completely die. And then next week they're on something else. Some more pressing thing comes up. And I've realized I didn't waste my time on things. And I think there's a point where we want to discuss that particular type of thing. But too much of that can lead some of us to constantly expect those miracles where someone else will be assigned the task that we don't want to do. Some of us have experienced in school where we have delayed studying for a test and then a storm comes and closes the school, or the instructor was sick that particular day and therefore we didn't have to take the test. Or they announce in class, I've decided to postpone the test, and something happens. And we love those miracles that basically fueled our procrastination. Oh, I didn't study for the test and they didn't even give it to us anyway. So we port that over into other areas of our life and we think maybe if I just don't do it, it will go away. It will just pass. It will just resolve itself and I just won't have to worry about it. And therefore we procrastinate in the hope of some divine miracle to come and take away this task or whatever this is in front of us, just hoping maybe it will go away, and it doesn't. Many, many times it does not. So as we mentioned last week, procrastination is not the problem. It is a symptom of other problems in our life. Thus, schedules, to-do lists, courses, willpower are not going to fix procrastination. Another quote from the book, when we identify our worth with our work, I am what I do, we naturally are reluctant to face challenges and take risk without self-protective defenses. If you believe that a judgment of your work is a judgment of yourself, then perfectionism, self-criticism, and procrastination are necessary forms of protection. Observing your hesitation to start or complete a project, then supervisors and family members, often with good intentions, add encouragement, pressure, and threats to get you moving. As the conflict builds between your internal fears of failure or imperfection and the external demands of others, you seek relief through procrastination. And he describes this bad cycle that we get ourselves in that is illustrated in the book, that perfectionism demands leads to a fear of failure, which then leads to procrastination, which then leads to self-criticism, which then leads to anxiety and depression, which then leads into a loss of confidence, which then leads into a greater fear of failure, which then leads into a stronger need to use procrastination as a temporary escape. It's a very vicious cycle that we can get ourselves into. This fear of failure, this self-criticism, anxiety, depression, loss of confidence, fear of failure that feeds even more procrastination. And it's a cycle that I am bound to break in my life, and I hope that you will continue on this journey with me in the next few weeks to break it in yours as well if it's something that you deal with. So before we stop for today, let me give you just a few action steps, which are really more like homework. And I want you to think about this during the next week. I want you to look and analyze your life and ask yourself a series of questions. First of all, I want you to ask, when I fail, am I critical of myself? What do I tell myself when I fail? So if there's any instance this week in which you notice that you are fearing failure or that you actually do fail at something, I want you to ask yourself that question. Am I critical of myself when I fail? What am I actually telling myself when I fail? The second thing I want you to do is to analyze your procrastination this next week, possibly even write it down. When do you typically procrastinate? What areas do you typically procrastinate in? Remember, I said this earlier in the show, but do you typically procrastinate in a major area in your life, a source of income, a source of identity and worth? When do you typically procrastinate and where? And why did you procrastinate? What were you thinking when you procrastinated? Was it a reward for you? Was it some of the things that we talked about earlier about the rewards that you got? Were you resisting pressure, trying to find some sense of control? Were you fearing failure and an attack on your worth? Did you maybe fear failure in the future by succeeding in some area? Or were you expecting a miracle and maybe hoping that it would just go away? Or was it because you were bored or that there was a stress in your life that you were trying to escape from? So ask yourself that this next week. Do a little bit of homework and analyze what's going on in your life. If you can write it down, even better. But if not, at least think about it. If you're driving to work someday, think about some of these issues, and I think it will make the remaining parts of these studies a lot more meaningful to you. Well, that wraps up this episode on why we procrastinate. Next week, we will dig deeper into Chapter 2 of The Now Habit by Neil Fiore, which deals with the topic of how we procrastinate. Knowing how you procrastinate might be even more important than knowing why you procrastinate. And I hope you will consider picking up the book to study even more in depth, because we're just kind of glossing over many of the main ideas in this particular book. The link is in the show notes to the book, whether that is a physical book or a Kindle book or an iBooks book or a electronic book on your computer, whatever the case is. I think you would deeply benefit from this book. And also, again, please consider doing the homework that I assign to you. This is like a class, and I'm your teacher, even though I'm learning along with you. I'm a student along with you. But the homework I assign to you is homework that I've done, and I continue to do every week, and I think it will help you even if you just do it mentally. As always, please consider leaving me a rating and comment on iTunes or wherever you listen to me on. It just helps other people know about the show. And I've actually had 2 or 3 people make some comments on there recently. Thank you so much. So since I last mentioned this, even going back into November, Paleo Runner, Wicked Me, some of the names are just hilarious to me. Timothy Moser, who I've mentioned several times, doing a new podcast soon, aceproductivity.com. He left me a great rating up here and comment. And just some other people, I'm not sure if this is AZ Car Guy, JF0605, Photo 1257. All of these just left some great comments, and just really appreciate the more that you do of that. I think I have 35 comments as of now. It's not some record I'm trying to go after, but it really does. It makes you more visible on iTunes. The more that you have reviews, the more that people leave you ratings and different things like that. And it's free publicity. And that's all I'm really after. I just want to help people. And again, I mentioned this last week. If you know people that deal with procrastination, tell them about this show. So tell them, hey, there's this guy and he's going through this weekly study on procrastination. And I know you and I have talked about it before. I think you would really benefit from it. You ought to check it out. Some of you managers who deal with people that procrastinate in life, why not make this part of your weekly meetings with them? It's not going to last forever. At some point, I'm going to quit talking about procrastination and move on to a different topic. So why not do it for the next month or two? And just say, we're really going to talk about this and see how we can become more productive in our own business. Consider doing that. I think it might prove very beneficial. Again, if you have any comments on this episode, I have a voicemail set up on my website at firstthingsproductivity.com. You just click the little microphone. You can use your computer free of charge. You don't have to sign up for anything. Leave me a voicemail. Leave me comments. Leave me questions. Happy to hear from you. It's maybe a lot easier than typing it. But I also have a discussion area set up at firstthingsproductivity.com/19, as in episode 19. At the very bottom of the page, there's a place where you can leave me comments. Again, free of charge, nothing you have to sign up for. I'm not going to be bombarding your email. You can just simply leave it there. So until next time, remember this. George Bernard Shaw said this: the healthy individual has an appetite for fruitful activity and for a high quality of life. So if that's really true and you believe that, then don't settle for procrastination in your life. Life really can be an adventure. So embrace today with passion and intention, and don't die with your music still inside you.